blockade of the country that aims to stifle its economy and achieve illegal regime change. We have a great duty to raise this outstanding humanitarian crime here, in particular because Boris Johnson's government endorses these sanctions and imposes his own. And as tonight's meeting is emphasizing, is currently supporting the Bank of England, which is refusing to return to the Maduro government over 800 million of Venezuela's gold held in its vaults. As the position of self-declared interim President Juan Guaido crumbles and Venezuela's opposition parties return to contesting elections, more pressure on the US and UK governments is needed to end the sanctions and give back the gold. The Venezuelan gold deposited in the Bank of England is a property of the Venezuelan people, not British banks. Preventing its return, like all such sanctions, only hurts the people in Venezuelan society, the poorest in Venezuelan society. Now, I am one who was grown up in a British colony, and there was a big lie we were told growing up in the British colony, that there was something called British justice, the best in the world, we were told. We could depend on British justice no matter what. There was guaranteed, like night or day, like night follows day, the best judicial system in the world. Many still believe that lie. And I want to help some to face the reality of British justice in some, just mention in some of the cases that have been celebrated over the years, like the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, the death in police custody, the racist profiling of Black people in stop and search activities. Our late leader, Commander Chavez, could be forgiven for thinking that moving Venezuela's gold from the USA to the vaults of the Bank of England was a smart move. He could not have foreseen the events leading up to the attempted theft of Venezuela's gold. Attempted, I say, for we must never let them get away with it. That they would risk the last shreds of any notion of British justice to be torn up just to please Washington is what is shameful. But shame, as the current crisis is showing in Britain, is not something this government understands. We have several esteemed speakers tonight, so I will give them the opportunity to expose this daring, barefaced, attempted day-life theft of Venezuela's gold. We will begin with speakers in the order that I have here. And the first speaker we have up, I'd like you to welcome Christine Bloor, who is the Labor Friends of Progressive Latin America, from the Labor Friends of Progressive America. Christine, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening, comrades and friends. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you and to make a few welcoming remarks on behalf of Labour Friends of Latin America to this extremely important event. This is a critical stage for Latin America and for Venezuela in particular. It's been more than 6 years since the United States first imposed sanctions on Venezuela. Absurdly, it declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Under Trump, those sanctions, which are clearly illegal under international law, and I have to say the remarks that our chair made in opening here about the regard that this government has for international law are an interesting thing. But anyway, they were ratcheted up to become a blockade of the sort that Cuba has endured for decades. And the impact has been truly appalling. A UN report last year described how these sanctions have devastated the Venezuelan economy massively and degraded people's living standards all round. On top of that, Venezuela has had to deal with the pandemic. While the US sanctions have severely restricted its ability to buy the full range of necessary medical supplies. If sanctions like this are inhumane at any time, during a pandemic, they are frankly nothing short of criminal. But while Venezuela is emerging from the pandemic with fewer than 5,000 deaths, US sanctions are still a very major concern. As the chair has said, there was perhaps a slight glimmer of hope when Biden took office in the United States, which he relaxed the blockade. But Biden soon dashed that hope in March by renewing the declaration of a state of national emergency regarding Venezuela. We're here today to say that dialogue and peace are the way forward, and for Venezuela to solve its problems and to move forward. We do not need aggression from the US or support of that aggression from anywhere else. Here in the UK, we do have this particular duty in this context to keep us talking about the ownership of Venezuela's gold. It's held by the Bank of England and it rightfully belongs to the Bank of Venezuela. And that's why we're here tonight. The gold should be given back and used to help provide food, medicine, and all of Venezuela need. We must continue seeking support for our petition and explain why both withholding the gold and all other sanctions which are illegal are so harmful to the Venezuelan people, especially, of course, as is always the case, the poorest and the most vulnerable. Comrades, we know that solidarity is the strength of those of us on the progressive side of politics. So it's wonderful that we have people here this evening demonstrating solidarity. And thank you for being here. Please make sure that you sign our petition and that you engage in all sorts of acts of solidarity that you possibly can with the people of Venezuela. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Christine, for reminding us why we must stand in solidarity with Venezuela. Declaring them a threat to Britain's, to America's security is something that we know is just a fig leaf for attempting regime change. It's the same excuse they use for attacking Grenada, a country of just 100,000 people, declaring them a threat to America's security. What they were afraid of is ideas, the ideas that we progressive are much better at producing. Our next speaker is well known to many of us, esteemed Dr. Francis Dominguez is a friend and associate who has spoken at many of our meetings at Caribbean Level Solidarity, and I'm pleased to ask Francisco to take the chair now, the floor now.
Thank you very much, Luke. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being at this meeting. In 1983, 1982, when the United States invaded Grenada, one of the excuses was not just the generic view or the generic position that Grenada was a threat. When Maurice Bishop and his government reorganized the army of the armed forces of Grenada, which modernized and established them as a proper force, the total number of them was 2,500. That was the size. And the United States, with incredible cheek, not to use a stronger word, actually used these to say that these 2,500 were a military threat to the United States. But anyway, let's get to our more important business of the day. I think the conditions for us to start making some significant inroads into the existing support for the US blockade are better this year than in previous years. Let me give you some examples. I'm sure that Carlos will say more about this. The UK government follows and supports slavishly, and I want to say this with capital letters and with neon, like this. It's so incredible. It is the only European country that hasn't abandoned or jettisoned Guaido. The formal position, the last I read, or the latest I read from the FCO, is that the government, the UK government, recognizes Guaido not only as interim president, which is bad enough, there's no reasons or no basis for this, but it continues to recognize Juan Guaido as the president of a gone National Assembly that was in operation legally and constitutionally from 2015 to 2020. That gives you an idea of how bad it is in terms of the position of the UK. And it is clear that the reason for this is US pressure, so that the UK maintains its control over the 31 tons of gold in the Bank of England, so that they have, as it were, a legal excuse not to return it. What we know of the legal case is that there are several various courts that have been throwing the ball to each other like a ping pong game match, saying, well, what do you think? And then there have been, courts have ruled that, yes, Guaido is the one that should have it. And then there have been other rulings saying that he shouldn't have it because he doesn't quite represent an alternative government and so forth. And the latest acrobatics, as far as I'm aware, is that given that the government of the UK recognizes the interim government, so-called of Guaido, then the court cannot do anything else but maintain that position, as it were. And the latest ruling is that one, which is absolutely terrible. Now, Guaido has been totally and utterly crushed. I think it's been totally defeated. The operation to try to make him an alternative government so as to complicate and destabilize as much as possible the Bolivarian government and Bolivarian society on top of all the sanctions that we know, has not worked at all. Clearly, the 177 votes at the United Nations was recognizing President Nicolás Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela was a big, big blow to US foreign policy on Venezuela. There is no question about it. In fact, 177 votes at the United Nations represent 92% of the total votes. And as far as we know, in terms of doing the counting, something like 16 countries with misgivings, many of them, continue to support Guaido as the interim president. So in that sense, not only Guaido has been utterly crushed and completely defeated, but US foreign policy on Venezuela on this particular question has been totally defeated. So what we can really do is intensify the pressure massively for three things. Number one, we want, obviously, the UK government to return the 31 tons of gold that belong to Venezuela to the Venezuelan state under the conditions requested by the Central Bank of Venezuela, which is they should be returned to the United Nations Development Program so that they use exactly for what the government says it wants to use those resources, which is medicine, food, and vaccines to support these people, particularly in the context of the pandemic. That's number one. But because the whole is such a massive highlighted issue, which is correct to do so, what we tend to miss out sometimes is the fact that there are several European financial institutions that are illegally retaining something in the region of $7 billion that belong to Venezuela in several banks. One of them is Euroclear. The other one is the Banco Novo of Portugal and a few others. So what makes it worse from the point of view of Europe, and hopefully we can do something about that as well or contribute towards that, is that given that those governments have voted or not voted against the resolution in the United Nations to recognize Maduro, then the legal position is very weak. So it seems to me that the conditions exist quite massively to insist on this. And the third one, which must be in a publicity and a propaganda with details, is the United States has confiscated and frozen illegally, of course, violating every single international norm, something in the region of $60 billion that belong to Venezuela. One of them is this oil company, oil distribution, gas company, or gasoline distribution company in the United States called Citgo, plus bank accounts and so on and so forth. So if you were to put all of these together, you know, the total amount of resources that are available that belong to Venezuela legally, morally, in every possible sense, we're talking about 60 to 70 to perhaps $80 billion. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. The GDP of Nicaragua is 14 billion. So, and the GDP of very successful Bolivian economy is 44 billion. So this is double the size of one of the most successful economies in Latin America, namely the GDP of Bolivia. So the amounts are huge. Venezuela will recover absolutely quickly and very fast were this to happen. But there is one final dimension, which is this. The United States, and we demand that immediately and unconditionally lifts all the blockade against Venezuela. The United States has imposed, since Trump, 243 sanctions against Cuba, and against Venezuela has imposed 431. We want them to be lifted immediately and unconditionally because Venezuela cannot trade normally with almost anybody in the world, and everything is blocked deliberately, consciously, actively by operatives, let me use that term, of the United States around the place, plus their accomplices, certainly in Europe and elsewhere, which makes it very difficult, even if the Venezuelan economy has recovered, this blockade makes it very difficult for a full recovery. So that's number one. The second point I want to make is regarding the necessity for us to understand that Venezuela must survive. Not only because it's morally correct that it survives, you know, Venezuela is entitled to decide its own path, has absolutely every possible moral right for its own national self-determination, which is being trampled upon and attacked by the United States and their accomplices in Europe, and certainly their cronies in Latin America. I must survive because if we're not to survive, then a very bad precedent will be set, which will mean that the United States, the regime change machinery of the United States will use this as an example, getting away with it against everybody else. And we cannot allow that. And the second dimension of this is the very fact that Venezuela plays an extraordinarily important example role of resistance in Latin America. And clearly the very fact, in my view, that Venezuela has been able to survive heroically thanks to the resistance of its people, this is a very wonderful example that encourages others in Latin America to actually do the right thing. And you have seen, I'm not saying that Venezuela is guilty of this, Venezuela is innocent, but other Latin American countries draw the conclusion that it is possible to actually go for a different path. Let me give you one example, which I think is miraculous, because I want to pay homage to the people of Venezuela and certainly to the government. To be able to, in a very short period of time, historically speaking, to bring down the level of inflation from 1+ million% to single digits, the last figures given by the central bank, which have been accepted, or certainly no question by anybody, since September is in the region of 7%. This is no exaggeration. This doesn't mean to say that all the problems of Venezuela have been resolved. It's still not out of the doldrum. But it shows that if you resist, if you insist on defending your people, if you insist on using whatever resources you have to make sure that the well-being of the population and national sovereignty is defended, is upheld, then it eventually pays off. Venezuela is recovering economically, which is very important. There's a huge amount of information in Bloomberg, Reuters, and so on. They seem to be worried that the recovery seems to be very strong. So the final point I want to make is this. This year is a crucial year. 2022, obviously, we have the conditions in the region exist for the relation of forces to shift quite dramatically in favor of progressive forces and against US aggression. I'm not going to go into any details about any single case, but we won the elections. Let me use that we, not like the Queen would do, but we in the sense of our collectivity in Latin America. We won the election in Mexico. We won the election in Argentina. We recovered democracy in Bolivia. We won the election in Peru. And now we made neoliberalism, go to pieces more or less in Chile, which is an extraordinary development. And this year in October, we have elections in Brazil. So you can see how things are going. My information from various newspapers in Brazil, particularly following Sao Paulo, which is, it's very right-wing, but sort of reliable on certain things, is that Lula is doing extremely well in the polls with a preference of 45% and going up. And Bolsonaro is in the region of 20 to 23% and going down. And what the right wing, the elite in Brazil tried to do, tried to produce an alternative candidate to Bolsonaro, a guy called Sergio Moro, who was the judge who persecuted Lula so illegally, so criminally, and so on. And it hasn't paid off because the best that Moro has been able to perform is, in the latest polls, 8%. In other words, the Brazilian elite and the United States are stuck with Bolsonaro. So we have everything to play for. And I think meetings like these, we need to organize many more in order to ensure that we contribute as much as possible towards supporting all the countries in Latin America, all the progressive forces, so that, we are able to actually defeat finally and manage to get the lifting unconditionally of all the sanctions. And we should go for the weakest link very hard, which is the UK government. We should really organize very seriously, very strongly to ensure that the gold is returned. If the gold is returned, that should produce a cascade in the rest of Europe. So we have everything to play for. So let me say, I'm full of hope, I'm full of enthusiasm for the survival of Venezuela. Viva Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for sharing that insightful analysis of the state of the left in the region. But not only that, for reminding us of the vast amount of money that is actually being stolen from Venezuela, and also the ridiculous claim that is on it and the lack of support internationally for that claim. We get to go forward on this issue. Thank you very much. Now we will have Susan Gray will do a plug, I think, for Venezuela at the moment. Susan, you there from the executive?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Luke. I'm going to say a few things about the campaign. Really, a plug for VSC. As we've heard, the overarching principle of VSC's campaigning work is to support Venezuela's national sovereignty and its right to make its own decisions. And this has been necessary because successive US governments have spent the last couple of decades doing their best to undermine that sovereignty. And they've used all sorts of methods, from propaganda, attempted coups, boycotting elections, violence on the streets, sabotage, and they've spent millions of dollars that they've funneled through various sort of opposition groups and other agencies to try and do that. And in recent years, they've imposed these increasingly severe sanctions that Francisco and others have been talking about, and now seizure of assets abroad. And the withholding of Venezuela's gold by the Bank of England is the result of one of the most shameful examples of the UK government obediently following US foreign policy. So these two issues, the sanctions and the seizure of the Venezuela gold, are very much the focus of our campaigning at the moment. And they've become even more important during the pandemic because of the devastating effects on Venezuela's ability to import essential medical and food supplies. Now, for the last couple of years, obviously, we've had to shift the focus of a lot of our work online. And online meetings, they're not ideal, but one consolation is that it does make it a little bit easier to involve international speakers and viewers. So we're pleased about that. So we've been very active with meetings like this and writing articles for news outlets and our own website and so on. And I think in the chat, there should be posted up some of the resources that we have. I mean, there are a couple of links to articles on the gold issue and the campaign generally for your information. We're also very active in social media, including Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. Those are the main ones. And there are links to those, I think, those should be posted in the chat at some point. So please follow us, and especially please join VSC. And you can do that via our website. Now, we've currently got 2 petitions going, which I can see are both in the chat right now. One about the withholding of the Venezuelan gold by the Bank of England, and another one condemning the US sanctions. So please do sign up if you haven't already. And finally, we usually have a point in a meeting when we pass a bucket round for donations. We can't do that today, but we do still, even though we're working online, we do still need funds. There are lots of things that do still have to be paid for. So we need funds to support our campaigning work. So my final point is, please make a donation if you possibly can, using the links provided. Join VSC if you haven't already, and that way we can keep in touch with you. So join VSC, make a donation, follow us on social media, and let's all make sure that Venezuela wins. Viva Venezuela.
Thank you, Susan, for reminding us that, solidarity work is so important and it needs funds. So please, don't forget to send that donation to Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. Our next speaker up is Suzie Gilbert, who's from the Free Alex Saab campaign, and Suzie will inform us on how developments are going with that campaign. Thank you, Suzie. Please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Luke, and hi to everyone around the world, and thank you all for what you do for solidarity with Venezuela. So moving from one seizure to another, I'd like to briefly touch on the US kidnapping of Venezuelan diplomat Alex Saab. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the case, but just to briefly remind you, Alex Saab is a Venezuelan special envoy who has a long relationship with the Venezuelan government and had been working to bring food assistance for the CLAP program in Venezuela, but also working with countries like Iran to bring medicines and foods and try to work around these illegal and brutal sanctions. Last summer, he was traveling back from Iran to Venezuela. He stopped in Cape Verde in West Africa to refuel, and there he was arrested and detained for several months, where he was tortured. And eventually, the US extradited him to Miami. There was a great outcry about this because obviously he's a diplomat. The US abides by the Vienna Convention, so it is illegal to extradite a third state, it's illegal to extradite any diplomat. But also his initial detention was very sketchy for many reasons that we'll post on here. So he's now been sitting for several months in a jail in Miami. And he has a court date in April, which will be a court hearing around the immunity issue. What we're asking folks to do is to sign a petition that CODEPINK has started to free Alex Saab. It explains the case in detail, the issue around immunity for diplomats, but also the important work he was doing to bring food and medical relief to Venezuelans in light of the sanctions. Various international bodies have spoken out about this extradition, including a number of UN special rapporteurs, the African Bar Association, you name it. There's all sorts of irregularities which you can read about, but I just wanted to point you to two sources for more information. One, if you might be willing to sign the petition, the Free Alex Saab petition by CODEPINK, which we'll post in the chat. And then my colleague Leonardo from CODEPINK, who's somewhere in the audience, did a fantastic interview with Alex Saab's lawyer, and they really get into the problems with this case. So if you want to dig into it, I really recommend listening to that. So thank you for the opportunity to update you a little bit. As I say, April is the court hearing around the immunity issue. So the more noise we can make around immunity and sanctions before then, the better. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Susie. That reminded why we need to be supporting the campaign to free Alex Saab. And be sure to sign the petition. Okay, our next speaker is Teri Mattson from CODEPINK, and she's a Latin American coordinator in the US, and she will be speaking next. Teri, please. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. It's wonderful to join all of you. I'm talking to you through out in the Campo in Nicaragua, and so just a little proof that I actually do work with labor in Latin America. So please excuse some of the background noises. Sometimes you're going to hear like some farm animals, perhaps. But anyway, I just want to say thank you to Labor Friends of Progressive Latin America and the Venezuela Solidarity Committee. It's always so wonderful to receive invitations to work with you. And it's just an honor to have known so many of you for so many years in solidarity with Venezuela. So I was asked to talk today what the holding of the Venezuela stealing is the better word of the Venezuelan gold that's sitting in the Bank of London, what this looks like to some of us, those of us from the United States. And I guess the first thing that I would say, in addition to working to get the gold returned, there are other assets that need to be returned to Venezuela as well, as Francisco mentioned. And one of those is the Venezuelan embassy sitting in Washington, D.C., and the consul office in New York City. So those are things that we specific as US citizens need to be aware of and focus on, and we at CODEPINK intend to do that. So there were some things mentioned prior that I want to revisit in what I share with you. Francisco mentioned Venezuela's role of resistance and changes coming throughout the hemisphere. So for me, as a US citizen, what the holding, the stealing, the theft of the gold sitting in the Bank of England is one thing. The Novo Banco case was mentioned as well. And now we've seen the United States failing to repatriate the gold to Afghanistan. This is a practice, a warfare practice, a foreign policy practice. It makes me, as a US citizen, ask several things. Is the United States broke? Is the United States concerned about a threat from China wanting a gold-backed currency? And then, of course, there's the starving of nations of its hard assets to prevent them from investing in domestic infrastructure and institutions that not only benefit their civil societies, but may perhaps also benefit allies as well. And then the other thing that we have to ask as US citizens is who exactly is Juan Guaido, and was he merely created to steal the assets? He's the person that these assets are transferred to, and he appears to be nothing other than that. And as Francisco said, the one small leg that he had to stand on coming out of the Venezuelan National Assembly, that term of the National Assembly expired or was voted out in December of 2020, and the new assembly came into power in January of 2021. So he's a tool to appropriate assets. I think in February of 2019, when he was anointed the presidency of Venezuela, there were over 60 countries that supported him. I think today, and Carlos, you can certainly correct me, it's 14, perhaps less. So he's not really much of anything except a conduit to transfer assets to. So this, for me, sitting here in the Americas, I'm talking to you today from Nicaragua, and I'll talk about that a little more. This process of stealing assets by the United States and along with the US allies, it's a form of financial starvation that I believe in the long run is not working and will not work. And specifically because the Venezuelan people understand what's happening to them. They have a political understanding of the hemisphere in the United States that is really, really keen. They have suffered so much in the last 5 to 6 years, and they really understand what's happening to them. They value national sovereignty as a people, and they also value their national resource sovereignty as a people. And I say that aside from political parties. So this grabbing of resources is about stopping infrastructure projects. And let's talk about that a little bit. So I'm talking to you today from Managua, Nicaragua. And last week, I had the honor of attending President Ortega and Vice President Murillo's inauguration. And I was also here in November for the presidential elections, followed by Venezuela and then Honduras. And I believe the outcomes of these elections through the month of November, which was a prescient month for the hemisphere, the outcome of these elections is a real statement in support of national sovereignty and against neoliberalism. And so I want to just say something really quick about the inauguration last week here in Managua. And I say this to you, Carlos, personally, and also I think, Leo, you're in the audience as well. It was a very exciting evening. President Diaz-Canel was here from Cuba, and as was your President Maduro. And the ovation that President Maduro received from the audience was very loud and very long. And quite honestly, it was stronger than any ovations for others, including the president of Nicaragua. And it was a response from the audience and the Nicaraguan people and the international audience that was in attendance as well. It was a pure recognition of Venezuelan resistance and the example that Venezuela sets for so many countries in the hemisphere and throughout the region. And I just think those of you from Venezuela listening, I just really want you to understand how powerful the welcome was for your president. It was profound and and he's a real example of resistance. So let's talk a little bit about what has happened in the hemisphere since the re-election of President Ortega, because I think in the long run, this is going to play out in a way that will make sanctions perhaps obsolete. And maybe that's not quite the right term. But so since November 7th, Nicaragua joined Cuba and Venezuela in leaving the OAS. Actually, Cuba never rejoined when they were invited. Nicaragua returned to recognizing the People's Republic of China, no longer recognizes Taiwan. And then on January 10, President Ortega announced a memorandum of understanding between China and Nicaragua to join the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a game changer, in my opinion. What we can see perhaps happening, depending on how large of the scale the infrastructure projects are in Nicaragua, is what many people are talking about here today, the actual completion of the canal running from Nicaragua, connecting the Pacific to the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua to the Caribbean Sea. And there is a deep port project on the horizon as well on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua. So what does this mean? It means there is now the very real potential of a trade triangle between Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and back to Nicaragua. A trade triangle through the Caribbean that those three allies support, and as well as their allies outside of the hemisphere, including China. This is, to me, what's happened in the last 60 days, a real overt awakening in the hemisphere of multilateralism. We have reached a point where this is a project that's been growing. It's a project that was overtly discussed by Hugo Chavez when he was alive and president. The South-to-South trade, the embracing of multilateralism on an economic level and also on foreign policy level as well. And it's been growing, but it's so, I believe, so overt now that it exists in reality. What else has happened since November 7 are regional elections in Venezuela, which supported the current party and government, and elections in Honduras that put a left of center president into power for the first time in 12 years. And then we saw a left of center government come to power in Chile in December, and we're awaiting, as Francisco said, the upcoming elections in Brazil and Colombia, which could have a profound effect on the hemisphere. So I have to say, it is our job as US citizens to get all of these assets released and put back into the hands of the Venezuelans. And there is so much that has been literally stolen. And I think, 200 years ago, this would have been called piracy. But I also have to say, it's a very hopeful moment. And I think that despite having so many resources stolen and withheld or failed to be repatriated, Venezuela is looking at economic growth. I've heard anything from 3 to 6% for the year 2022. I've heard as high as 8% too. So imagine a country that has been denied so much of its own wealth, having achieved this projection of annual growth of 3 to 6%. It's a phenomenal story. And it's very, very exciting. And I think it's one that we should elevate, support, and as was mentioned earlier, plan delegations and go visit. It's extraordinary what has been accomplished in Venezuela. It's extraordinary what her people have suffered the last 5 to 6 years. And I'm sorry, I get a little emotional when I see what all of you have been through. But I think there's a lot of hope. And what Venezuela represents with this annual growth coming, projected annual growth, is truly hope for the entire hemisphere. And this creation of a multipolar hemisphere is perhaps an opportunity to have a balance of power with the United States and force some additional negotiation that needs to occur to make an America for all of the Americas. So with that, I'll let you go. I just want to say I love all of you. And I really, it's profound, the fight that you have all put up. and endured. And it really is an example of resistance for all of us in the hemisphere of the Americas, throughout the world as well, but specifically here in the Americas. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Teri, for sharing your enthusiasm and your feelings about the region. And I think for giving us some hope again about the elections that have been taking place in the region and the prospect of growth, and reminding us of the resilience of the Venezuelan people, and also, I should say, for the people in the region, because they've all been under sanctions and under immense pressure over a long period of time from the neighbors to the north. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker up is Ben Chaco from Morning Star. Hi, Ben.
Hi, what a privilege it is to speak alongside everybody tonight at this really important meeting. Last month's Supreme Court ruling is obviously very bad news, but it does have one virtue, which is that it makes it very clear that the refusal to hand over the $1 billion worth of Venezuelan gold, which is still in the Bank of England's vaults, is not a legal question, it's a political one. Politicians have nowhere to hide after a verdict like this. It's because of our government's continuation with this ridiculous idea that Juan Guaido, a man who's never even stood for the presidency of Venezuela, is the president of Venezuela. That is the reason why all of this gold is being withheld from a developing country which is battling a global pandemic with its hands tied behind its back because of a criminal US blockade. It's being deprived of resources that could be used to fight the virus. And that's exactly, as Francisco pointed out, it's exactly what Venezuela has said that it wants the gold back for. In 2020, the Venezuelan government submitted a request that the Bank of England sell some of that gold and transfer the proceeds to the United Nations Development Programme to buy healthcare equipment, medicine and food and so on. So there's always this narrative from governments like the British government, the US government, that sanctions are about punishing political figures and so on, that we can't let the government in Venezuela get its hands on this money because we don't know what it will do with it. Well, actually, the Venezuelans have made it very clear what they need the gold for, and they've proposed a model which would allow complete international oversight of how those proceeds were used. They shouldn't have to, of course, it's Venezuela's gold. They should be allowed to do whatever they want with that gold because it's the democratically elected government of Venezuela. But that does remove yet a further excuse from Britain for this ridiculous situation. Sadly, while some countries like Cuba, like China, responded to the COVID pandemic by rushing doctors and medical equipment to wherever they were needed in the world, the virus has brought out the worst in other countries. The United States actually tightened unilateral sanctions on Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela as COVID was spreading, even blocking the delivery of medical equipment from China to Cuba. This showed an utter disregard for the loss of the lives of ordinary people, the loss of life that would be caused by depriving medical equipment in a pandemic. These are the people that the US claims it wants to liberate with its policies, and yet they're pursuing this line. And that shouldn't surprise us, as the US-based Center for Economic Policy Research estimated Donald Trump's sanctions on Venezuela resulted in over 40,000 Venezuelan deaths, and that was only in the years 2017 to 2018. Unfortunately, Britain's record when it comes to medical internationalism or pandemic solidarity is in some ways even worse than the United States' record. Maybe that shouldn't surprise us either. Of course, the British government hasn't shown much solidarity with the British people when it comes to protecting them from the virus. But Britain is opposing a vaccine patent waiver internationally, something which the United States supports. And I think we should argue that the $1 billion of Venezuelan gold that we're holding back should be seen in the same light as this. We're depriving developing countries of resources that they need to cope with the pandemic. And I've talked a bit about the US responses to the pandemic and so on, because I think that's the second important point here. The first one is that this is a political question, not a legal question, however much it's been batted around the courts, as Francisco says. But the second point is it's not a political decision on behalf of the British government. It's a political decision on behalf of the US government. the whole recognition of Juan Guaido in the first place was a US regime change bid, even less subtle than the commandos that Donald Trump dispatched from Colombia. We might have hoped that stunts like this would end, recognizing a minor opposition politician who most Venezuelans had not even heard of as the president of that country. We might have hoped that Biden would have made a change, but again, as has been mentioned, the Biden presidency has been a big disappointment in this regard. Biden has not changed policy on the new Cold War in China. He has not shut down Guantanamo Bay, and he's continued this ludicrous absurdity that Juan Guaido, who since last year's elections isn't even a member of the National Assembly of Venezuela, is somehow the president. He has no legitimacy, no territory, no support inside Venezuela, even from the Venezuelan opposition anymore. So as I think former Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arieta put it, he might as well claim to be president of Narnia. This guy is nobody. For us in Britain, this is a humiliating fix. Boris Johnson rode to office on a promise of getting Brexit done, of taking back control was the Conservative slogan. But what is the point in taking back control to say, boasting that decisions are not being taken in Brussels, if instead they're going to be taken in Washington? US sanctions are stopping us from paying £400 million that we owe to Iran. As a result of that, a British woman is in jail in Iran, and the diplomatic negotiations on her release are deadlocked. British businesses are fined for trading with Cuba in violation of sanctions and a blockade, which the British government says that it opposes. This is a complete farce. And I think that this is the angle that we need to take when campaigning in Britain against it. But this is an offence to our sovereignty too. This is not our quarrel with Venezuela. And it is an insult that we continue to follow the coattails of the United States on this. Juan Guaido governs nowhere. He represents nobody. The Venezuelan opposition participated in the recent elections. There's a good opportunity for progress to a less violent future for Venezuelan politics based on respect for the democratic process. So keeping the gold is an act of piracy, it's an act of theft, and the British government has to be made to give it back. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Ben. So that reminder that, the ridiculous situation that Britain finds itself with Venezuela's gold, and it gets deeper and deeper. And clearly also a reminder about the COVID-19 and the way the capitalist countries have responded to this with huge promises at the beginning of how they were going to share vaccines with the global South. And we see none of that materializing. And with a different response from the countries of the socialist countries that have supported poorer nations with assistance around the COVID-19. That brings us to the final speaker, who is none other than Carlos Ron, the Deputy Finance Minister for Venezuela, for the Bolivar, and he's also the President of the Simon Bolivar Institute and the Deputy Foreign Minister. Please, Carlos Ron, you're on the floor.
Greetings, friends. It's so great to see all of you. First of all, let me give you greetings on behalf of our Foreign Minister, Felix Plasencia, who wanted very much to be here with you tonight. And because of a last minute meaning that he had to run to, he was not able to be here. As you know, we're in preparations for important meetings that are going to take place in the next couple of days in the United Nations, where the government of President Nicolas Maduro is recognized as the only legitimate government of Venezuela. So he had to rush out on that agenda. But I want to start by thanking the organizers of this event, of course, Labor Friends of Progressive Latin America, Caribbean Labor Solidarity, the Venezuelan Solidarity Campaign, of course, Morning Star, CODEPINK, the Free Alex Saab campaign, everyone that I see, and I'm glad to be sharing this space with. Again, it's important for us, and we're very happy that you are always in solidarity with Venezuela, specifically with regards to these issues, such as trying to recover the assets and the money that belongs to the people of Venezuela from blockade has been imposed on us. I have been asked about the broad effects in general terms of the current legal and unilateral coercive measures that are being imposed on Venezuela, as well as our challenges and then about a bit about our economic recovery as well. Despite these illegal sanctions, we have achieved that we have achieved illegal sanctions, and that we're hoping to continue achieving in 2022. But I must, a day like today, I must also begin by reflecting. Exactly a year ago, there was, like many of you have already referenced, some sort of hope that the Biden administration would mean a difference, a change in policy towards Venezuela. And what we have to say is that unfortunately, the policy remains intact, that for fears of the Miami reactions, they continue to support this farce that, that it's neither a government, but has actually become famous now for stealing Venezuelan resources. And that has been its foremost achievement. And in doing so, the United States government, the current administration, has also torpedoed dialogue by kidnapping Alex Saab, as Susie already mentioned. And, the conclusion really is that all options are on the table except for diplomacy, except for mutual respect. And that is the sad legacy a year after. It's a wasted year. A year has gone by where things could have been much different. But first, I think it's important to understand that for many years now, the United States has been waging a form of hybrid warfare against Venezuela, aimed at undermining and overthrowing the democratically elected government, first of President Hugo Chavez, and now President Nicolas Maduro, in order to replace it with a government that will submit to Washington's spheres of influence and general design for the region. This type of warfare, as you all know, expresses itself in different forms. There's a media narrative that questions Venezuela's democratic principles and practices. There's a use of political violence that includes everything from an attempted coup to attempted mercenary invasions to the attempted murder of President Maduro. And there's also this component of the so-called sanctions, which we in reality always say that they are coercive measures. They're not real sanctions. As real sanctions can only be applied by the United Nations Security Council. But these coercive measures are aimed at causing enough pain and suffering in the Venezuelan population that they will lead to the eventual breakdown of the constitutional government. The imposed coercive measures by the United States and a group of some of its allies have blocked the possibility of Venezuelans having functional bank accounts in most of the international banking system. This means that Venezuela's right to pay for things such as vaccines, medicine, health supplies, equipment, spare parts, specialized machinery, food supplies, fertilizers, raw materials for industries, all of that has been essentially cut off. This persecution is against the Venezuelan state and also against individuals that hold key offices, which in turn harms the whole country and the country's international interactions. These measures, combined with the strategy to undermine President Maduro by recognizing the self-proclaimed interim Juan Guaido, is precisely what has led to the current situation or gold reserves that you've spoken amply about, and which, as Ben was reminding us, could have been put into use in the middle of the pandemic. We actually asked that these resources be used for the pandemic to cater to Venezuela's needs. By now, Venezuela could have had, not even by now, by the middle of last year, we could have had all of the Venezuelan population vaccinated had we had those resources available and ready for us to use. This aggression against Venezuela increased significantly under the Trump administration, but again, as we said before, it has experienced no alterations whatsoever under President Biden. We continue to feel this harassment, this persecution that targets our economy, our public finances, that has affected Venezuelans' freedom to trade. Even worse, our capability to respond to this COVID pandemic has really, truly been put at risk. These measures were intentionally taken so that Venezuela would not have access in time for the vaccines. Different manufacturers felt threatened by the United States sanctions regime and did not even want to sell to Venezuela. Payments for the COVAX initiative, as you may know, which is an initiative from the World Health Organization, were initially blocked. Once we had reached the 90% amount of payment, the bank transactions was stopped until, and for a while, we had to wait until they were actually, the funds were actually unblocked and released. If it was not for the solidarity of countries such as Russia, Cuba, China, India, Turkey, Iran, we wouldn't have not managed to achieve what we have today. Today we have, for the closing of 2021, we achieved 89% of the population vaccinated. As of this year, as of this week, we are already vaccinating people, or giving the booster shot for our population. So other noticeable effects that I think we should mention of these measures can be seen in the deterioration of public services, such as water supply, electricity, waste collection and disposal, where access to spare parts and maintenance has been impossible due to these so-called sanctions. Water, for example, in most of Venezuela is pumped to up to the urban centers. But if there's no pumps or no spare parts to repair the pumps that break down, and no companies to sell them to us because of the fear of retaliation by the Treasury Department, then it becomes really difficult to guarantee that we can provide water service to people and to the majority of the population. It's difficulty to guarantee good public services at all. Furthermore, the effect of interrupting our oil sales, of blocking our capability for renegotiating our debt or selling bonds, the effect of the blockade in general made Venezuela lose 99% of its income. We went from averaging $54 billion per year as an income to earning less than $600 million last year. This is outrageous. This is really not, this is an exaggeration. This is 99% of a loss because of these sanctions. It is the result of this persecution against our oil and our bank accounts and the kidnapping of our accounts that over $30 billion Venezuelan people's money in bank assets and accounts have been taken and are being still withheld from the Venezuelan people. But in the middle of this, I think it is also important, like Teri mentioned, to stop and also see a positive that we can say about this story. There is a positive side, and this positive side is definitely the resilience of the Venezuelan people. We still face challenges for improving national income so that we can strengthen everything from public services to worker salaries. When we can talk about economic recovery that was brought on by the efforts of Venezuelan workers and sound government policies. I do make an emphasis on the issue of the efforts of the Venezuelan workers, because what we have witnessed in some of our basic industries and including in our oil industries, has been that with the lack of in face of the lack of spare parts, in face of the lack of updated technology to proceed and to repair some of our processes, we have had the real ingenuity of our skilled workers come up with solutions, create solutions out of nowhere, be very creative and solve problems that otherwise we wouldn't be able to solve. And they have been able to pick up, to help pick up production and to help move forward the economy. And they do this with a strong consciousnness that they're doing it as part of their commitment to their country, to their families, to their class as workers. And this is I think it's very important, very inspiring, and hopefully you can come to Venezuela and see this for yourselves at some point. There's no doubt that these coercive measures diminish the state's income and therefore that of the Venezuelan working class families and businesses. In fact, the impact of more than 400 coercive measures from the Trump era has included not only a persecution against the oil sector, but also against mining, against currency, against the use of cryptocurrencies, against the use of any resources that Venezuela could rely on. But President Maduro's administration came up with the Bolivarian economic agenda, where he highlighted 17 economic engines that were to address what in fact amounts to a wartime economy. It's important that our progressive friends around the world are aware of this. Venezuela's economy was turned into a wartime economy. But through the resistance of the resilience of the Venezuelan people, we're expecting to grow this year, like Teri said. ECLAC, which was one of the sources, it says to expect 3% growth in Venezuela, which is higher than the growth expected in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, or in Ecuador. The Economic Recovery Program launched in 2018 is showing its results. We've kept the Bolivar as a currency, but have also allowed for the use of international currency in the country. Price controls were substituted by a scheme of concerted prices. We took on tax reforms, and we implemented a public spending and investment program to lower the fiscal deficit. Subsidies were optimized, such as the subsidies to interest rates on loans and on gasoline. And furthermore, we created a new legal framework to ease and guarantee investments under the anti-blockade law. Meanwhile, we now have a National Council of Productive Economy, where we maintain constant dialogue with all the sector's productive forces, large and small. And we have revised our tariff policy in order to protect the national industry. Therefore, the internal commerce is rising, particularly in the non-oil sector. And as a result, we have experienced a recovery of about 7.5% of economic growth in the last semester of 2021 alone. We've also managed to recover oil production and production at the refineries and at the petrochemical complex. This year, we managed to recover 4 of our refineries and over 90% of our petrochemical production, thanks to the efforts again and the ingenuity of our Venezuelan workers. It's a system that is based basically on 100% US or foreign technology, and it's very difficult to recover if we don't have those resources. But we were able to increase our output from up to 1 million barrels per day by the end of 2021, and our goal is to reach the 2 million by the end of this one. So the perspectives for 2022 are that we can overcome the high inflation rates that we have experienced in recent years as a result of this economic war. It is also important to take into consideration that that Venezuela can speak of recovery because throughout all this time, providing social protection for our people was a priority for our government. Hyperinflation was fought with social programs such as those carried out through the Patria or the Homeland system, a subsidized food distribution through the CLAP or the Local Committees for Supply and Production Program, and throughout other programs that we call missions, that they have been set out to guarantee that the living conditions of the Venezuelan people are not deteriorated in the middle of this aggression. Our objective is that with the current recovery rate, we're able to transform the new income that we're going to receive in 2022 into more education, more healthcare, more housing, and better salaries. The transition towards a socialist model that is humanly gratifying. A date like today, when we remember that in 1973, Amilcar Cabral was assassinated, and a hero from Cape Verde. I can only think of those words of him. It says, always bear in mind that the people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in anyone's head. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward and to guarantee the future of their children. And that is precisely the spirit of what we're doing and what we're trying to do. We're trying to guarantee, despite this, in the middle of this aggression, that we could really guarantee, we can really fight and struggle for the benefit of people. Coming year, we will continue our diplomatic efforts in order to recover what belongs to all of the Venezuelan people. You know very well the case in Bank of England, and we will not give in. At any point, we will continue the legal processes. I will not go into any details as to not affect the processes themselves. But I do I do restate the commitment of the Venezuelan government to making sure that we can return those assets to its rightful owners, which are the Venezuelan people. And it is, you know, this fake government that is being recognized by British authorities is none other than an outrageous corruption scheme that has been questioned by the opposition itself. It is a criminal gang. Some say it's a criminal gang of about 1,600 people that are receiving salaries of about $1,000 a year coming from those Venezuelan resources, as well as U.S. taxpayer funds. So for those people in the United States, there's a lot of question about what the use is being made of those funds. While here in Venezuela, we're being deprived of the necessary funds that are needed for our development. Venezuela's outlook for next year, again, is positive. And I think it's important to state those things and to come out in, because yes, we are struggling, and yes, we are in a fight, and yes, we are in the middle of a warfare, unconventional as it may be, but we have to always remember the positive. And I think our region, like some of your interventions mentioned, is also looking very promising. The neoliberal model is outdated. It was based on deceit. It was based on manipulation. It was based on electoral fraud many times. It was based on repression, like we saw in Colombia and like we saw in Chile. And it's also based, and we should always, remember this, and it was also based on the division of the progressive camp. Because sometimes our divisions would lead to our failures into confronting this neoliberal project. But I think the region is overcoming those divisions, and I think the region is in a moment where we can look forward towards a stronger unity, whatever our diversity may be. Venezuela has always been at the forefront of questioning this model and building our own alternative. We did so in 1989 when the people took the streets to protest the IMF adjustment. And we did it 30 years ago when the civil and military rebellion led by Commander Hugo Chavez opened the way towards this profoundly democratic process that we today call the Bolivarian Revolution, a political process that stands against the neoliberal model, against all forms of colonialism and imperialism, and against the criminal formulas promoted by international financial institutions that have only resulted in greater poverty and resource exploitation. Venezuela spearheaded a progressive wave in Latin America with the election of President Hugo Chavez in 1998. Then Lula came and Kirchner came in 2003, and the Uruguay's World Front won elections, and so did President Daniel Ortega with the return of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And then leaders of the stature of Evo Morales and Rafael Correa led revolutionary processes that updated their constitutions and brought new life to the masses in Bolivia and Ecuador. And of course, Cuba has always been there as a beacon of humanity, to showing us the real sense of what humanity should be. So there's a new wave, like Francisco said before. There's a new moment underway. We've seen the recent elections. Teri also mentioned, so I won't go into detail. But I think there's a stronger unity around processes of integration, such as CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is far better in tune with our collective needs and our aspirations than the outdated model of the Organization of American States. And in any case, we look forward in the coming years to further cooperation unity among Latin American and world progressives. It is important that we do this. It's important that we think about this, as there is a surge throughout the world of new kinds of fascism that are trying to attempt against the rights of people. Again, thinking about the United States and thinking about how we are usually described and attacked as being a dictatorship, yet if that effort was being placed more on protecting voting rights there, and try to reverse the process that's ongoing now, where by now 19 states are trying to reformulate their voting laws to prevent African Americans and other minorities to exercise their rights. Then the United States could be moving forward, but they're wasting time attacking Venezuela, attacking about 30% of the world which is under their illegal sanctions. So in closing, friends, and I thank you for this opportunity. Like I always like to thank all the effort you put into setting up these spaces so we can meet, that we can share ideas, that we can listen to each other, because I think it's important. It is, you know, it's very key for Venezuela to have international support, to have people to stand up for Venezuela, because the media narrative is very negative. The media narrative is very strong. We don't have the enough outlets, and we don't have enough spaces to talk about the truth of Venezuela. But we are always grateful that the working people in the UK, in the US, and everywhere else are always have never broken their solidarity and their ties to Venezuela, and continue to believe in this process as we do ourselves. So thank you again for this solidarity. Thank you for your bravery in confronting your own institutions and your own enemies in order to reverse these criminal policies of Venezuela. And we look forward to continuing to stand up together against these illegal sanctions and against injustice in any of its forms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you'll join me in putting your hands together for the Deputy Foreign Minister in that speech. He's covered so much ground and given us so much hope. And I think we've heard from all of the speakers. As we're fast running out of time, I will try to conclude the meeting and reminding people that, you know, all the speakers have called for, you know, an end to sanctions, no intervention in Venezuela, return of the gold. They've spoken about the hardships, the difficulties that are there, but they've also presented the hopefulness of the region that, you know, the pink tide is beginning to go red and things are improving. That the people of Venezuela will not be defeated, that they've gone through some of the harshest sanctions any country have endured for a very long time. And we know it's had its toll on the ability to heal people from the COVID-19 and other hardships that they've gone through. And we can see clearly that what the neighbor to the north is trying to do is to force a situation in Venezuela where people will reject the Venezuelan government. They have failed miserably. Nicolas Maduro is being elected again with a high majority, and the people are forever resisting imperialism and showing the world that this resistance is possible, and as an example to us all in the region to continue to fight against imperialism. Viva Venezuela, viva. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much.